Welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. My name is Michael LeBlanc, and I am your host. This podcast is produced in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. Recorded at the Cox School of Business at SMU in Dallas, Texas, in front of a live studio audience, my guest is my good friend and remarkable retail podcast partner, Steve Dennis, on the occasion of the book launch event for Leaders Leap, his latest book already climbing up the charts as one of the top business books of the year. Let's listen in now. Good evening, everybody. Fantastic to be here. I'm recording this tonight for the Voice Retail podcast. Let's hear it for you. Get to be a live audience on the podcast. Say hi to Canada. There we go.
So laugh at my jokes, even if they aren't funny.
That's right.
It's really awkward.
We'll move on from the shameless self-promotion segment of the interview. Let's talk about you. So
yes, let's talk about me.
Let's talk about Leaders Leap. Let's talk about. Your book is not a retail-focused book. It's much broader canvas than that. Yep. But you do start the book with a story from your past, from working at Sears, a parable, really. And it really does set the frame, not just for your thinking over the number of years since then, but also for the book in some way. So share that with us.
Yeah, I'll try to make this brief. So a few of you know, particularly one person who worked with me at this time, which we'll come back to in a second. I started my retail career at Sears in 1991. At that time, Sears was the second biggest retailer on the planet. It had previously been the biggest retailer on the planet, but had lost that position a few years earlier to Walmart. And I had a bunch of different jobs there, but in 2001, I was named the head of corporate strategy. I often say that being the head of corporate strategy at Sears seems like a bit of an oxymoron in retrospect. But we had a new CEO, and our charge was to finally figure out how to save Sears and turn this around. So we got this big project team together. We paid Bain & Company quite a lot of money to help us basically look at a whole range of potential options, things that were relatively incremental to things like blowing up the stores and turning them into home-focused. But it was a whole range of things. We had a tremendous amount of support from the board. We did competitive analysis, consumer research. I mean, this was a really, really big effort, and lasted, I think, about 18 months. And we were preparing the board, and we eventually got down to a more specific focus, and then we laid out this big plan. And several of us got the opportunity to present it to the board and asked for quite a lot of money and several years to put this thing into motion. And the board said yes. And
so you're feeling pretty good.
I was feeling pretty good. I was like, been working like crazy for 18 months. A bunch of other people have been, there were a lot of people involved in this, and we were all ready to go. And the day after, I was sitting in my office, and this guy named John, who might happen to be in the audience today, who worked with me, and he had been leading a lot of the competitor and customer analysis, and was also working on this new concept store we were going to open. It was just part of the agenda to get off the mall. And he came in, and he looked kind of sad. He is kind of a sad guy, to be honest, a lot of the time. So I just, there he is. Look at him. I mean, come on. So anyway.
Much happier now.
And so he came in and he said, I said, what's up? And he said, it was great. We got this approval and everything, but I don't know. The more I've been thinking about it, what we got approval for is not it's not really a strategy to win. It's just a strategy to suck less. And because John is a very eloquent guy, and it just sort of dawned on me that he was right. Like we were closing gaps in our performance, and we were definitely moving ahead. But there was really nothing that we were going to do that was going to get us to leap ahead of the competition, or even in some cases really catch up, because of course competition wasn't standing still.
You've sometimes described that as innovating to parity.
Yeah, innovating, right. It was just, there was a lot of where we compared. I won't go too much if people are interested, we could talk about it offline, but there was a lot of saying, well, Kohl's has got us on convenience or on value or, private branding or whatever, and, we're a 5, they're a 9, if we can get to 9.
Get to 7.
Or, just close the gap. But it was really ultimately sort of backward thinking. So anyway, I mentioned that because I don't know if you've heard this, but things didn't turn out so well at Sears. If you're hearing this for the first time, I'm sure you're as shocked as many of us are. But anyway, so I had that experience, and I ultimately left not too long after that and came down to Neiman Marcus, which I call my journey from the outhouse to the penthouse. It was a very nice journey. And Neiman's, was a much more successful retailer, and so for a while I kind of was away from having to worry about that. But then when I went out on my own as a consultant and analyst and writing and speaking and all this kind of stuff, I just kept seeing these companies that, either got themselves into trouble and then they couldn't get out of their own way. And I think in retail, we've seen, just in town here, Blockbuster, Radio Shack, Pier 1, once, these incredibly dominant brands that, basically have been sleepwalking through this revolution that has gone on. It's this book, somewhat comes out of the Sears experience, but, even more so because of the pace of change. It comes out of what we've seen, this sort of constant struggle. And I keep coming back to this idea that, if the world has changed so much, because I think everybody agrees a lot has changed in the last 5, 10, 15 years. Like, that's not a controversial opinion. But if the world has changed so much, why have you changed so little? Like, how does this happen? And so that was kind of the exploration I wanted to go into with this book.
The Sears story is not your only personal reflection in the book. We had a virtual launch on Monday, and one of our guests, Seth Godin, and Seth's author, you might know him, 20-some number of best-selling books. And he's a bit of a mentor for you from an author, a good friend as well. And he said something I thought was interesting, which was that he thought it was your least Harvard-like book. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, he went to Stanford, so I think he was... Well, so one of the things I wanted to do with this book, if any of you read Remarkable Retail, I'm proud of it. It's done well and everything, but it's a pretty academic approach. It's very argument driven. Here are a bunch of here's my hypothesis. Here's a bunch of analysis to support it, and so it's very argument driven with lots of support. And I think that can be useful. But with this book in particular, partially to challenge myself, and just because of how I was feeling in terms of what I wanted to do creatively, I also thought, well, I'm not sure the problem with leaders not transforming is that they don't know what to do. Most, I can tell you at Sears, when I first got there, we knew that Home Depot and Lowe's and Best Buy were stealing market share. We had tons of analysis. It wasn't mysterious. Several people, including I think John, worked on some models to predict market share losses and financial implications if we didn't do anything about it. So it wasn't like we weren't awake to.
It wasn't a lack of talent or resources or these things. Really.
And so if you think about, just to pick on, since many of you know, I pick on department stores a lot. Department stores have lost market share every year, depending on whose numbers you believe, for 20 plus years. Gone from 16% or 15% to 4 or 5. In the meantime, TJ Maxx, Ulta, all these companies. So I always throw out this fun fact. Ulta, most of you probably know Ulta. Ulta is worth, not to make it all about stock market value, but Ulta, which was 100 stores in 2005 or something, is now 1,500 stores or something. Ulta is worth more than Macy's, Nordstrom, Kohl's, Dillard's, and Neiman Marcus combined. TJ Maxx is worth, I think the number is 20 times as much as the 5 department stores combined. So how do you watch for 20 years this market share go? And I'm sure the people at these companies understand why this is happening. So, anyway, I don't think I guess that's a long way of saying, I don't think the issue is you don't know you're in trouble or you don't have any understanding that this is a problem. But for reasons that I think we'll get into a little bit, I wanted to understand more, less the argument about, what happens to companies don't change, but why do companies not change? And from that standpoint, I want to make it more sort of inspirational, I guess, for lack of a better term, than highly prescriptive or, here's 800 case studies, because I'm lazy too. I didn't want to do the 800 case studies, but I didn't want to argue from that standpoint of just anecdotes and studies that other people have done.
So reflecting on really the genesis perhaps was Sears, but reflecting on everything you experienced after that, and even widening your aperture to other industries beyond retail, because as I said, your book isn't really strictly a retail book. You started to see a pattern forming, and you've developed kind of a model, let's call it.
Yeah.
So share that with us.
Yeah, well, let me just quickly, so this isn't really the heart of the book, but I try to set things up. So one thing, if you're familiar with Remarkable Retail, one of the things that I started to see when I went out on my own is this idea that even very good is no longer good enough. If you go back, well, I'll talk a little bit more of it in a second, but it's just harder and harder to even get noticed in a world of abundant choice and just the noise. And so what I argue in Remarkable Retail is you have to be truly remarkable to break through the clutter and to engage with the customer and win. So that was one thing, I started working on 10 or 15 years ago. I've been speaking about, eventually ended up as Remarkable Retail. And ultimately this idea of being remarkable. The other part, which I didn't get into so much in Remarkable Retail, is just what I call the speed of disruption. And different industries are experiencing different disruption at different rates. One way to visualize this is just to see how quickly certain technologies have gotten adopted. And it just seems like things like ChatGPT sort of come out of nowhere. Threads now, which is only less than a year old, now has more users than Twitter. So just to use a retail example, Temu and Shein are the two fastest growing retail companies ever. And
in the history of retail.
In the history of retail, and Temu's 20 months old or something, and Shein's a little bit older. But so we're just seeing this accelerating pace of change where it's more exponential in many cases than linear. So anyway, and this is kind of a mashup of some other people's work, including Clayton Christensen's a while ago. But I started to think about, if you think about the speed of disruption and you think about how much better you need to be, the customer value you deliver, the competitive differentiation you deliver, maybe I can sort of align this as a way of thinking about it. And what most companies do, and you really have to do, is optimize your business model, right? So you make relatively small changes, comparatively slowly on average over a period of time. That's the core of what lots of companies do. Now, some companies get more aggressive, and they say, okay, we're going to have a series of transformation initiatives that you might call sort of sustaining transformation. So that's, maybe you got to change your store fleet, or maybe you got to do a big remodel or something in the retail context. But what we've seen in a lot of industries is this kind of leapfrog of really disruptive transformation that happens more quickly, and somebody does something really bold. So think about Uber and Lyft in the taxi industry. Uber's not a better taxi. It's they've taken advantage of technology and a different business model to get people, right? Or Vrbo or Airbnb revolutionizing the lodging industry. So you can imagine that if you're a business that is doing mostly business model optimization, or even maybe something a little bit more aggressive, if you're in an industry where there are these competitors or just consumers or customers are demanding more and more, this gap can get to be quite large. And the thing that I worry about, and I think now as we look at, just again to kind of pick on department stores, they're so far behind, you have to wonder, is it even possible to catch up? Or even if you can come up with a plan, are investors going to go along with it? So this is the kind of thing I set out at the beginning of the problem. But then, the question is, okay, what do we do about it?
So you coined the term, the curse of the timid transformation. In fact, you just published an article in HBR with that.
Yeah.
So maybe it's and you've been talking about the retail industry for a few minutes. Maybe you could set the frame as to how we got here.
Yeah.
For a couple of minutes, because there's lots of. It's a good framework to set. So let's get back to the curse of the timid transformation, and just take us back to 1995. How did we get here?
Yeah, so this is the reference where I lose anybody who's much younger. So set the Wayback Machine, those of you probably know that, to 1995, just to pick, kind of pre-internet really, or pre-e-commerce. So just quickly, if you're anywhere close to my age, you will remember this. If you're younger, this is a short history lesson, so just hang in there. But basically, if you go back to the mid-90s, retail, like 98% of retail, involved the customer going to a physical store, so the other 2% is mail order catalog, basically, right? But you go to a physical store, and you in order to know really what they had, you had to go and see it, and maybe get some sales help or whatever to figure it out. But the competitive environment was basically whatever happened to be in your town. And so if you live in a small town, maybe your choices weren't so great, or you had to drive quite a long way. But the basis of competition was your location, your sales staff, your assortment planning, visual merchandising maybe, and then the competitive environment was, the guy down the street or in the mall or what have you. Like that was the world. And then obviously, slowly at first, but then faster and faster, things really began to change. Largely at first by e-commerce, but then eventually, cloud computing and other things allowed for technology in particular to disrupt this. So,
and you've often said that we're looking at Amazon. You often said it's sometimes Amazon is blamed for these things, but really this transformation in retail started happening.
Yeah, well, I often use this. I've been using this chart for a while because I think it's funny, but also because. It's easiest to visualize this, I think, because we all know that, Amazon was this tiny little company selling just books and CDs, and then, then they got into consumer electronics and all these product categories, plus services, plus web, plus et cetera. So, they're now 6% or so of all retail. But, so obviously e-commerce has been hugely important. Amazon's been incredibly disruptive. But just even going back to the example of the department stores, a lot of times Amazon gets blamed for the problems with the department store. Department stores were losing market share before Amazon even sold any of that merchandise. So it wasn't just e-commerce. And by the way, department stores can have websites, right? So it's not, as if Amazon had something that nobody else could do. I mean, they obviously have a ton of advantages now. I'm not saying that's equivalent.
Well, if you even think back to Sears, right, it had a very robust catalog business, which was
absolutely
very much the infrastructure and precursor to.
Well, even I think John may remember this number, but I think in like 2001, I think Sears online sales were bigger than Amazon's. There was a point. I mean, they moved obviously past pretty quickly, but Sears and Walmart and a bunch of companies had. Were pretty early adopters. Neiman Marcus had, I think, website in 1999. So, I mean, it wasn't as if websites didn't exist and there weren't big investments. But a lot of other things happened. Retail for a long time, and this is something I get into the book, and it's not just a retail phenomenon, is, a lot of businesses were basically sort of what I would call peak of the bell curve businesses, a little bit everything for everybody. So, that's Walmart, and that's, category killers. We're serving a wide, we may be focused on home improvement or appliances or whatever, or Bed Bath & Beyond, Toys R Us, these category specialists, but they were still selling a wide variety of assortments, and they were more destination stores. But we've really seen retail go from, these destination malls to closer to customers. And closer sometimes is on the phone, but closer is also all the neighborhood centers or power centers that is, where you find the Ultas, where you find the TJ Maxxes and so forth. So it's not just online, and it's not just Amazon. There have been some really fundamental changes in most industries.
So you've diagnosed the book. You've diagnosed the issue, and now let's turn our minds to the book. And it's this where you talk about mind leaps.
Yeah.
And you have this concept, and you have a framework for that. So let's talk about that.
Okay, so one of the great quotes I have in the book is actually from Seth Godin, where he wrote this blog post a bunch of years ago. I really love it, which he asked the question, have you ever seen a timid trapeze artist? And the answer is no, because they either get fired or they get killed. And the rest of the quote is around how if you're really going to get to a better place, you've got to let go of the past. That's sort of the metaphor. And I think in a lot of cases where you see companies that engage in a timid transformation, so what I mean by that is companies say they're going to really change, and in many cases maybe they have a chief transformation officer, or they pay a bunch of money, not to insult any of the other consultants in the room, but we go into this big effort, we're going to have this revolutionary new strategy, and really what it is a slightly better version of what they're already doing. That it's not enough of a leap or departure to really win back. If you're really struggling, a lot of that is winning back customers that you lost, or getting infrequent customers to shop more, or what have you. So I think there's an aspect of being willing to say, what got me here is probably not going to get me there, and in fact, it might actually get in the way, because if I keep going back to the same old ways I've done things, that may prevent me from seeing what I need to do. So for me, in exploring the kind of the core of the book, these mind leaps, is, well, what is it that keeps leaders and their teams stuck? And I think as much as there are strategy points, there are also more kind of personal characteristics or so forth. So I think that gets us to
your leadership mind leaps.
Yeah.
So take us through these. Some of these are kind of, they feel very fundamental or foundational, and others kind of build upon that. But you got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
Start with number one, which is a pretty important one. It's very personal.
Yeah. Well, so even before I get that, the reason why a lot of these are mental constructs in a way, so that's why it's mind leap. But it's also kind of like, well, to think about it, like, here's the way you probably operate today, and then here's a relatively significant different way of operating. And not all of these will apply to every company or every single leader. But one of the things I say leading up to this is, I think we have to take a hard look at ourselves sometimes. I know this book is more personal than, that was, I guess, maybe what Seth meant too about it being less Harvard, was I talk more about some of my own experience and struggles and mistakes that I've made and hopefully have mostly learned from. And the first one is this idea of crushing your ego. And I'm just going to talk really quickly about each of those in the interest of time. But I think this is really pretty fundamental. And I don't just mean sort of obnoxious, narcissistic leaders. I mean, that's part of it. But I think there's been such a big shift from, at least when I was coming up through leadership, that is the leader, that's kind of command and control. You've got all the answers. Never let them see you sweat. Don't admit that you maybe don't know what's going on. And I think particularly in a world, I don't think that's a great way to be in general, but I think in a world that's changing really, really quickly, if you're not willing to bring more people into the equation, to say when you're struggling or say when you don't understand something, it's very hard. It's kind of like put your mask on first. You're not in a position to do some of the hard work that it takes to figure this stuff out. The second one, and this is, I'm a little bit more in this chapter kind of in your face, because I think there's just a ton of denial on the part of, I work with some clients, and sometimes I love my clients, at least the ones that pay me, and sometimes there's such, the reason I say open the aperture is there's such tunnel vision that, they're so used to doing things a certain way. And are you familiar with Clayton? I know a few of you probably are familiar with Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovator's Dilemma, which is from the 90s. And, I'm trying to kind of contemporize some of his work, frankly. I borrow quite a lot from him. But one of the things that the point he makes in The Innovator's Dilemma is that good managers are often their own worst enemy, that you've become really successful at doing this thing. And so it's hard to see often what the change that's coming, or just, I'm good at this, I don't really understand that, but that also tends to perpetuate a certain amount of denial. And so that ability or that expertise got me to where I am today. Right.
That's the essence of the innovator's dilemma, is like, collectively, this got us to a very big, very important leadership position.
Right.
So, now.
Yeah, so you're sort of your own worst enemy because, you keep doing what you've done. You're fiercely protecting the core. Sears is a great example of where so many of our discussions about things that we could do differently, and we looked at a ton of things and even tested a bunch of things, but it was like, well, if we were to open that appliance store, well, that's going to cannibalize our base business, right? Well, It turns out, there was plenty of cannibalization. It's just by other companies, So, but that protection of the core is really one of the keys, I think, to the innovator's dilemma. And when things are changing really quickly, and it's, I don't want to say that it's easy to know. Like, I'm sure some of us, like when I was at Neiman Marcus, we had a project to try to figure out how to use MySpace and Second Life and all this kind, right? And those turned out to be nothing. And a few years ago, Metaverse, right? Clubhouse, whatever. Like, there are things that come quidsy. Like, there's lots of things that all of a sudden look, these are going to be the next big thing, and they turn out to be nothing. So it's not easy to figure out. But I think the more you do this work, the more you bring in other people with different perspectives, and you develop the capacity to discern, I guess, what's important. The third one. So these first two are more kind of personal characteristics. Then there are a couple that are really more strategic points that I think are worth thinking about. So generally, I believe that the era of really mass retail is over. Not that Amazon or Walmart or Costco are going to go away, but I think now it's so much harder to try to create a business that is that peak of the bell curve, a little bit of everything for everybody, unless you have enormous scale and scope. And generally speaking, it's about price. And if you don't have a low-cost position, it's famous race to the bottom. Worst thing that can happen is you might win. And consumers or customers can so easily find the particular thing they want as well. So I think the challenge is to really narrow your focus, kind of improve your aim, go deeper on what customers want. And this term that some of you may know from, it's a Nike thing about edit to amplify, but get rid of the stuff so people can really see what's special and unique. And that might be product assortment, that might be service, there's a bunch of things it could be. But I think more and more we're seeing businesses that are much more, kind of the classic specialty store business, but kind of taken to the next level.
We had the opportunity to interview Joe Kudla, the founder of Viore, which was a very good example of this, right there. How much room is there in the activewear, Lululemon, Alo? It's very crowded, but he found his perspective, I'm on the West Coast, I'm not really into yoga, I want activewear, but I'm not, really want that kind of product, and now he's carved out a very special, not big, but expanding and very successful.
Yeah, and I should say that this is not to suggest that you can't have a big business. Sure. Tractor Supply, this is a brand I've worked with a little bit over the years. Most people know Tractor Supply. I mean, they're very focused, and they really know their customer. And so it's very tightly edited. Now, that's a multi-billion-dollar business, so it's not as if you can't get big. But I think the idea is they're not, you sort of look at that business and say, well, you're in some categories that, Petco's in, you're in some categories that Home Depot's in, you're in some categories. But, it works because they've got a very clear view of the customer.
Yep. And
they bring it all together. So it's not to say you can't have a big, valuable business. And then I think start with wow. This gets a little bit back to the remarkable retail kind of concept, but how do you really distance yourself from the competition and offer customers incredible value? And I think particularly anybody who's followed my work for a while know that I use the term bifurcation way too much, but the world is really bifurcated into value, generally speaking, value-oriented retailers, and then either more upscale or specialty kinds of retailers. Yeah. And it's the middle that's really, when you look at store closings and bankruptcies, it's almost entirely these retailers in the middle, this idea of a retail apocalypse. Well, it's not really true.
Right.
It's just bad retailers are going out of business. But most of it, other than some companies get too much debt or something crazy happens. But
and on the other axis, if you've got luxury and value, you've also got experience and efficiency, right?
Right.
And if you're in the middle of those, you're that, what you've coined the phrase, the boring middle.
Well, you're not the cheapest or the most convenient, or you're not the greatest assortment, but you're also not offering any special service or really unique product or an ambiance or what have you. So I think in terms of wowing the customer, I think it's harder and harder to do it on the value side because there's such big players that are so good at it. I'm not saying nobody's ever going to figure that out. 5 years ago I probably wouldn't have said there was any space in kind of the dollar store category, but now Five Below and Ollie's, and there are companies that have been able to find more than a niche. So
I mean, Temu is an example that
for sure.
We can argue whether they've figured out how to do online at the dollar store level, or whether they've just figured out how to set a big pile of cash on fire. But I guess history will tell us that in a few years.
A few companies like that. But start with wow again. So if you think about how 3 and 4 related, special not big is to really narrow your focus and go deep. And start with wow is to find those 1, 2, 3 things that really take you to the next level. Then just quickly, 5, think radically is really about being willing to perhaps blow up, in some cases, what you're doing, or at least take a wrecking ball to it. But it's also about expanding the way you think about businesses. So in some cases, that might be as straightforward as we have products, but can we build more services and solutions around it?
Yep.
Or a different kind of model. But just going back to say Uber, it's really being focused on the customer job to be done. Like, I want to get to this place. I don't necessarily have to. Well, actually, maybe a better example is Airbnb. Because, if you're Marriott or Hyatt and you think about, well, how do I have a better hotel? Well, maybe have a cooler bar or better beds, or, it's incremental instead of, well, why do we even have to have a hotel? Like, why, because they're constrained by the business model. So I think department stores, for example, I just love picking on department stores, I'm sorry. But department stores, it really hasn't been, other than maybe you could argue Market by Macy's, which was a good idea 20 years ago. I'm not sure it's such a good idea now. But nobody even tested, well, why really? Why do we have to be in a mall? Why do we have to be 2 stories? Like, why didn't, either do like an incredible destination store or get closer to the customer? And so in some cases, you just have to really, I think, rethink it. We'll talk about an example of that in a second. And this other one, this is what the HBR article was about, is this idea that incremental change or slow and steady is often the riskiest strategy of all. And we see that playing out, all the time. It's probably pretty obvious at this point. But I think, the hard thing as leaders, and I can say, I've struggled with this myself, is, there's all the, the spreadsheets and all the, we've got to have an ROI and business case before we do anything a lot of times, right? And that just tends to lead to slow, well, it may not even lead to progress, but, it's very slow. But in the meantime, your competition is leapfrogging ahead, or somebody like an Uber or whatever comes out of left field, and suddenly you're in trouble.
It's that competing against companies who don't have an installed base, right? They have a fresh start, they have a fresh perspective. They don't have to worry about their existing.
Yeah, it's very liberating, and it's not always so easy to do. Like, a lot of these things are for sure easier said than done. But hopefully there's a chapter on each of these in the book, and I try to tease these out more and give some examples. And then and one thing I should also mention about the form of the book just quickly is, because as you mentioned, this is not just a retail book. I think it's hard enough because, like, when I wrote Remarkable Retail, retail is such a huge industry with all these different component pieces. So it's hard to give advice that's going to work for the high-end specialty store, but also works for the the discount grocer or what it's just so. This time my approach was to try to keep it a little bit more high level, but at the end of each chapter I have a bunch of questions, and I hope that is what kind of frames up the conversation, either for the reader, for yourself, or if you buy it for your whole management team or whatever, you can discuss these questions and try to make it more specific too.
I found that part of the book particularly interesting because whether you're leading a transformation or you're trying to engage a transformation, how do you engage your fellow executives? And here's a copy of the book. But then let's ask ourselves some of these questions at the end of each chapter, and I think it opens up a really interesting narrative. Like, it's actually a very useful tool to enable, how do you get these mind leaps, and what does it actually mean in our business?
Right, yeah, I hope so. And then the last one is just, I got a need for speed. Like, just, I think one of the quotes I have in the book is from Miguel Cervantes about, the problem is you think you have time. And, I think in a lot of cases, like, even, not to pick on Sears, but you could at least argue that 20 years ago, 25 years ago, because almost all retail was physical, it took, Starbucks a long time to go from a few stores. It took Home Depot a long time to build all these stores. Well, today, Temu, Shein, they're not, the rate determining factor is not, getting permits and designs and, however much capital we can amass to grow. So I think it's quite scary, but I think it's also, culture of experimentation, just being able to be more agile rather than kind of these locked in ways that a lot of big companies anywhere tend to be run.
So in the book, you both have a retail example and you open the aperture and you have a broader example outside of the retail industry about there's good news. People have and can do this. Share some of that with us.
One of the things I've learned, and we probably all know, is that, as human beings, we're not that great at assessing risk. And I think the hard thing that I found is to try to really quantify the cost of inaction. And so I've worked with a couple management teams to really say, well, here's path A, path B, path C. And it's a little bit like scenario planning, but it's also making real the cost of going slow or the cost of not trying.
The opportunity cost.
The opportunity cost, and also understanding sunk costs or sunk, that a lot of management teams get hung up on that sort of idea. But here's one of my favorite retail examples is RH Galleries, if you know, there's a big one here on Knox. I don't know how many people know this, but if you go back, say, 20 years, Restoration Hardware, as they were formerly known, was just a really weird store. It was the manifestation of their catalog. They had a bunch of gifts and literally hardware
Lots
sort
of
of stuff.
Lots of
and
copper.
then they, were adding gift items, and it ended up being just this kind of weird store. And then Gary Friedman became the CEO, and they started to add linens and some other things like that. And then they made this, this was a big, bold move to build these palaces of retail. And even though the home business is a little bit slow, so their results the last few quarters haven't been great, I mean, this has totally transformed the company. Now, I don't think everybody needs to go from, this little kind of crazy store to these big bets. So I don't love the example from that standpoint. But, when you look at not that many retailers that have gotten into trouble have been able to come back. They're one of the examples of a company that had, and they did it by, still thinking about the solution they wanted to provide, but doing it in a really
and closed
way.
Several of their stores in Toronto. Their store, which is very similar to that, is actually the old Sears part of the Yorkdale Mall.
Yeah.
So they actually took over that and closed all their stores in the city, and they just focused it on one. And that's just an overarching their business model.
Yeah. So and then the last one, which I love, is Netflix. They bought this billboard a couple of years ago, and I think in West Hollywood, which I just find is sort of inspirational. So I often find that I spend 20 minutes talking negatively about department stores or whatever, and here's a little bit of hope perhaps. But you think about Netflix, not a very old company. They have pivoted 3 times.
Yeah.
DVDs, streaming, production, and so they're still kind of in the same solution set, right? But their delivery mechanism has completely changed. So there are examples of companies that have pivoted pretty successfully. Unfortunately, there are not a ton of them, but I think there's some things to be learned. So I think we're almost done, right? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, last couple of quick things. We talked about advice for the audience, and really, it's the mechanism in the book to engage your fellow leaders in a dialogue around this transformation leaps with your handy questions. Now, you've been out launching, done an innumerable number of podcasts, and you've been talking to a lot of people. And anything surprised you? Let's talk about the book launch. Anything surprised you about the feedback or what people say to you, or the feedback you've gotten, or even the questions that you get asked? Anything? What's your impression of the reaction so far to the book?
People have tended to resonate more with kind of I'll call the personal transformation sort of stuff, and not as much on, because what I'm learning is, I think people, it's not news that things are changing quickly. It's not so I don't spend that much time on it, but I don't think that's the part. I may have a slightly different take on it maybe than somebody else, but that's not groundbreaking. But I think sort of getting in people's face to say, you got to start with yourself. You got to look in the mirror. I tell some stuff about some things that happened in my life that I think a few people are surprised about. Because I'm trying to walk the talk a little bit. But it's just been interesting. And I also, it's a short book, really. And I think people don't. We all buy the Blue Ocean Strategy. I don't know.
Right.
I'm going to be honest. I have never read Blue Ocean Strategy. I've sort of skimmed it, but it's like 450 pages, and there's a lot of examples.
It's a good touchstone.
No, it is. No, I'm sort of trying to be funny, but a lot of people don't really, books are like little souvenirs, in a way.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping it's something that people will read and get.
That was certainly your intention, an action thing. Well, listen, let's leave it there. No matter how many times that you and I talk, I always learn something, I always take away. So I appreciate you, my friend, and I appreciate all of you, very generous audience. Thanks for your attention. I do have one question, maybe for also, these big longhorn, it's my first time to Dallas, really. I haven't been to Texas much. These big longhorn cattle, when do they come out? I haven't seen any of these. They come out at night?
You have to go over to Fort Worth.
Yeah. I was thinking in Toronto, the raccoons come out at night. I was waiting. I haven't seen any yet since I've...
Don't hold your breath.
Oh.
Very good. And I'd like to thank Michael and Steve.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, follow on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically each week. And be sure and check out my other retail industry media properties, the Remarkable Retail Podcast with Steve Dennis and the Global E-Commerce Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, Senior Retail Advisor, Keynote Speaker, If you want more content or chat, follow me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.